Today we have an Americana compilation. Story number 1 is the headline, Wooden Leg, 8 Children and $75,000. This story comes from New York. It says, Mrs. Josephine Garino, one of the traveler's aid inspectors who speaks many languages and attends to the arrivals at the docks for the society, tells of a number of interesting marriage cases in her report at the recent annual meeting. One of these was of a young woman who had come from Italy to marry a man with 8 children and a wooden leg. They called Mrs. Garino to look into the case, feeling that the girl was not getting a very fair deal. The husband-to-be consented to having his fiancée questioned. "Have you ever seen this man before?" Mrs. Garino asked the girl, and she replied that she had not, for her uncle had made the match. "And are you willing to marry a man whom you have never met and whom you know nothing about?" "My uncle said he was a good man," returned the girl. "Do you know that he is a widower with 8 children, and are you willing to wash and iron and work for all those people?" "Yes, I know," she said. "If I was not willing to work, I would not have come." "Did you know he had a wooden leg?" "I knew he was lame." "You were wise to send for a good husky girl," said the inspector to the man. "Will she have to do all the work for your family?" "Well, I have one girl a school teacher, one in college, 2 big ones, one little one 7, one 9, one 11, and one 13, returned the man. Then said Mrs. Garino in concluding her story, "We asked him if he had any money, and he said he had $75,000, so the girl was not doing so badly after all." "Another one of my cases," said Mrs. Garino, "was a lovely Armenian girl who had come to marry a young man she had never known before. How is it, I asked, that you people marry without knowing each other?" "Our mothers made the match when we were children," said the man who spoke English fluently, "and they are wiser than we, and know what is best for us." Story number 2. The headline says, Divorce Mill Grinds While You Wait. This story comes from White Plains, New York. It says, the police are seeking Robert F. Miller, 110 West 34th Street, Manhattan, on the story that he is the divorce miller who, with a chorus of 8 professional correspondents, girls of varying prettiness, ran the divorce mill in the branch of the New York Supreme Court in Westchester County. The grist of this mill is said to have been about 100 fraudulent decrees in 2 years. Justice Seeger is interested in finding Miller too, because the justice's name appears approving papers the justice denies signing. Uncontested divorces seem to have been Miller's specialty. It is said on the basis of information from one of Miller's clerks, an angry wife would consult him, describing some real or fancied rival. Then Miller would name the fee, select the most suitable girl from the chorus of 8, whom he changed as necessity dictated, and the testimony was forthcoming. District Attorney L.P. Davis of Westchester County, where there are estates of many wealthy persons, is making the inquiry at the request of the judges. Mr. Davis's assistant, Walter Ferris, who announced the inquiry, said he had no trace of Miller. It was recalled that few persons had seen Miller since January, when Justice Seeger discovered the decree the justice says was forged. According to Mr. Davis, he cannot find that Miller ever was admitted to the New York bar, although he was licensed to practice in Vermont and Indiana. Mr. Davis believes Miller was careful to provide against the too frequent appearance, under various names, of women the judges would recognize as having appeared before them using a different name. For the rest, he depended on the pressures of court work and the probably short memory of the judges. Story number 3 is the headline, End of a Marriage a la Fannie Hurst. This story comes from Chicago. It says, Fannie Hurst's theory that the propinquity of husband and wife leads to marital unhappiness received a blow in Judge Sabbath's court. Bertram Shapley, a music writer with studios at 1401 West Adams Street, blamed the theory for all his domestic troubles. He testified that his wife, Mrs. Mabel Shapley, a writer by profession and artist by temperament, had refused to live with him on account of new ideas she had absorbed. The Shapleys were married in 1898 and lived together until the summer of 1917. While the wife wrote stories, her husband composed songs. They were happy. Then early in the year of their separation, Mrs. Shapley received an inheritance of $40,000. She decided to make a trip to Europe and get some local color for her stories. "That's what started all the trouble," said Mr. Shapley. "While in Europe, she lived among the so-called aesthetes and artists and got some freak ideas. When she returned, I met the boat." "Well, honey," I said, "I'm sure glad to see you. I've got a nice little apartment waiting for you in Chicago." Would you believe it, Judge? She calmly informed me that for the sake of our happiness, she intended living in New York. She didn't believe in husbands and wives living together. I came to Chicago alone. Mrs. Florence A. Carpenter and Miss Frances Carpenter, the husband's mother-in-law and sister-in-law, corroborated his testimony. Both Mrs. Carpenter and her daughter make their home with Mr. Shapley. I can't imagine what possessed Mabel, said the mother. She was a loving wife before she went to Europe. Judge Sabbath extended his deepest sympathy to Mr. Shapley and granted him a decree. Story number 4 is the headline. How can you steal your own motor car? This story comes from St. Louis. It says, if a man gives his wife an automobile for Christmas and then she leaves him in the car and he sells the car to another man and his wife comes around and drives it away, is it theft? That was the question put up to the prosecuting attorney's office when James Gibbons of 3850A Cottage Avenue asked for a warrant for Mrs. Sarah Crawford at 1046 East Park Avenue, St. Louis, who has no hesitancy in saying that she drove the car away from in front of the Gibbons home the other evening. And what's more, she still has it and expects to keep it. Why shouldn't she keep it? For didn't William Crawford, her husband, give her that car last Christmas? When your husband gives you a car, it's yours, and how can you steal what's yours? What does William Crawford say about the Christmas present? He says he bought it just before Christmas and shuttled it home Christmas Eve. And when she called it her Christmas present after that, he smiled indulgently and let it go at that. But after a while, the Crawfords had a falling out. They separated and Crawford has been living at 6063A Horton Place. That was awkward for Crawford. There he was with a car in his hands and no wife to tell people that he gave it to her for Christmas. There was nothing to that, so he sold it to Gibbons. Mrs. Crawford found it out and watched until Gibbons drove up in front of his house and went inside. Then Mrs. Crawford stepped into her Christmas present and drove it away. The police hardly knew what to do. They hesitated to charge the woman with stealing her own Christmas present. They solved it by letting her out on a common law bond. Then Gibbons went to the prosecuting attorney's office and a warrant was issued charging grand larceny. These stories come from the great state of Wyoming, being reported in the Encampment Echo of May 5th, 1921. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we'll see you next time on Americana Archives.